You wake to the sound of steel being sharpened in the pre-dawn darkness of the Tower of London, May 19, 1536 AD. The rhythmic scraping of whetstone against blade cuts through the morning mist like a death knell, each stroke deliberate, methodical, final. You are Anne Boleyn, once Queen of England, and in less than 4 hours that blade will separate your head from your shoulders. The stone walls of your cell seem to pulse with your heartbeat as you sit on the edge of your narrow bed, your hands trembling not from cold but from the weight of knowing. Outside your window, you can hear the carpenters hammering together the scaffold that will serve as the stage for your final performance. Each blow of their mallets echoes through your bones, a countdown to oblivion that has been building for weeks. Your ladies-in-waiting move about the chamber like ghosts, their faces pale and drawn. They dress you in a grey damask gown with a white chemise beneath, the colours of mourning and purity. Though you wonder bitterly which applies to you now, the irony isn't lost on you that Henry chose these colours. Even in death he seeks to control the narrative, to dress you as the repentant sinner, rather than the wronged wife. The air in the tower carries the scent of river mud and human misery, but this morning it's tinged with something else, the metallic smell of fear and the sweet smoke of incense from the chapel where prayers are being said for your soul. You can hear the murmur of voices beyond your door, the shuffle of feet, the clink of armor as guards take their positions. The machinery of death is already in motion, and you are merely the central piece in this elaborate, choreographed horror. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The nightmare that would end with Anne Boleyn's execution began not with treason or adultery, but with Henry VIII's desperate need for a male heir and his growing obsession with Jane Seymour. By January 1536 AD, Anne had suffered yet another miscarriage, this one particularly devastating as it occurred on the same day Henry suffered a serious jousting accident that left him unconscious for 2 hours. The symbolism was lost on no one at court. As the king lay near death, so too did Anne's hopes of securing her position through motherhood. The miscarried child was reported to be male, a detail that would haunt Anne's final months. Henry, who had broken with Rome and torn England apart to marry her, began to whisper that their union was cursed by God. The same theological arguments he had used to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon were now being turned against Anne. The irony was exquisite in its cruelty. The very justifications that had elevated her would now destroy her. But Henry needed more than divine displeasure to rid himself of Anne. He needed legal grounds that would not call into question his own judgment or the legitimacy of their daughter Elizabeth. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, and a man whose survival depended on anticipating the king's wishes, began to construct a case so elaborate and damning that it would not only destroy Anne, but obliterate any sympathy for her. The first thread Cromwell pulled was Anne's relationship with court musician Mark Smeaton. Smeaton was everything Henry was not: young, lithe, dark-haired, and possessed of an easy charm that made him popular among the court ladies. On April 30, 1536 AD, Cromwell had Smeaton arrested and taken to his house in Stepney, where the young man was subjected to interrogation that likely included torture, though no official records survive of the specific methods used. What we do know is that Smeaton, who had initially denied any improper relationship with the Queen, emerged from Cromwell's questioning ready to confess not just to adultery with Anne, but to specific details that would form the backbone of the case against her. The timing and nature of his confession suggest a man broken by pain and terror, willing to say anything to make the agony stop. With Smeaton's confession in hand, Cromwell moved swiftly to construct a web of alleged conspirators. Henry Norris, the king's groom of the stool and one of his closest friends, was arrested on May 1st during the May Day celebrations at Greenwich Palace. The irony of arresting Norris during a festival of spring and renewal was lost on no one. It was as if Cromwell was deliberately poisoning every symbol of joy and celebration. Norris had been with Henry for over a decade, a trusted companion who had access to the king's most private moments. His alleged crime was not just adultery with the Queen, but treason of the highest order, the betrayal of the man who had elevated him from minor nobility to a position of tremendous power and influence. Under interrogation, Norris maintained his innocence with a steadfastness that spoke either to his genuine virtue or his awareness that confession meant certain death. William Brereton followed Norris to the Tower on May 4th. Brereton was a gentleman of the King's Privy Chamber, a man whose Welsh origins and relatively modest background made him dependent on royal favour for his position at court. Like Norris, he was accused of adultery with the Queen, but Cromwell added an additional layer to Brereton's alleged crimes: conspiracy to murder the king so that Anne might marry one of her lovers and rule through a puppet husband. The most shocking arrest came on May 5th when Sir Francis Weston, barely 25 years old and recently married, was taken to the Tower. Weston came from a wealthy family and had no need to risk everything for the Queen's favour, which made his inclusion in the conspiracy particularly puzzling to contemporary observers. His youth and the fact that he had everything to live for made his alleged participation in such a dangerous plot seem almost impossible to believe. But it was the final arrest that sent shockwaves through the court and revealed the true depth of Henry's cruelty. On May 2nd, George Boleyn, Anne's younger brother and Viscount Rochford, was arrested on charges of incest with his sister. The charge was so monstrous, so utterly beyond the pale of acceptable behaviour, even in the morally flexible Tudor court, that it served a specific purpose. It made Anne not just an adulteress, but a creature so depraved that no punishment could be too severe. George Boleyn was everything his sister was: intelligent, cultured, and possessed of a sharp wit that had made him both popular and dangerous at court. He was also deeply loyal to Anne, a loyalty that Henry saw as a threat to his own authority. By charging George with incest, Cromwell wasn't just destroying Anne's brother, he was ensuring that no one would dare speak in her defence, lest they be seen as supporting such an unnatural crime. The speed with which these arrests occurred, all within 5 days, reveals the carefully orchestrated nature of the conspiracy against Anne. This wasn't a gradual discovery of wrongdoing, but a precisely timed demolition designed to give Anne's allies no time to organise a defence or even fully comprehend what was happening. Anne herself was arrested on May 2nd, immediately after returning from watching a tennis match at Greenwich Palace, where she had observed Henry playing with Francis Weston, the same man who would be arrested 3 days later as her alleged lover. The symbolism was deliberate and cruel. Anne's last moments of freedom were spent watching the king enjoy himself with the very man who would be accused of betraying him. The charges against Anne were read to her by her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, a man who owed his position partly to the Boleyn family's rise, but who now found himself in the position of pronouncing her doom. Norfolk's participation in Anne's destruction revealed the brutal calculus of Tudor politics. Family loyalty meant nothing when weighed against royal favour and personal survival. Anne's reaction to the charges was recorded by several witnesses, and their accounts paint a picture of a woman struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what was happening to her. She reportedly laughed when told of the adultery charges, not from amusement, but from the sheer absurdity of the accusations. The idea that she could have conducted multiple affairs under the intense scrutiny of court life, where her every movement was watched and recorded, was so preposterous that laughter seemed the only possible response. But as the full scope of the charges became clear, adultery with 5 men, incest with her brother, conspiracy to murder the king, and plotting to marry one of her lovers after Henry's death, Anne's laughter died in her throat. She was being accused not just of sexual impropriety, but of treason so comprehensive that it touched every aspect of her relationship with the crown and court. The journey from Greenwich Palace to the Tower of London took Anne through the same streets where she had ridden in triumph during her coronation procession just 3 years earlier. Then the crowds had cheered and thrown flowers. Now they watched in sullen silence as the fallen queen passed by in a barge surrounded by guards. The contrast must have been almost unbearable, to travel the same route that had once represented the pinnacle of her ambitions, now bound for a place from which few emerged alive. Upon her arrival at the Tower, Anne was housed in the same apartments where she had stayed before her coronation, another deliberate cruelty that forced her to confront the distance she had fallen. The rooms that had once been prepared for a triumphant queen were now a luxurious prison, complete with the same tapestries and furnishings that had witnessed her greatest moment of glory. Sir William Kingston, the constable of the Tower, was instructed to keep detailed records of Anne's words and behaviour during her imprisonment. Kingston was a career administrator, a man who understood that his own survival depended on providing his superiors with exactly the information they wanted to hear. His reports paint a picture of Anne as alternately defiant and despairing, sometimes maintaining her innocence with regal dignity, other times breaking down under the weight of her circumstances. One of the most revealing aspects of Kingston's reports is Anne's apparent inability to believe that Henry would actually have her executed. She repeatedly expressed confidence that the king would show mercy, that their marriage and shared history would count for something in the final calculation. This faith in Henry's essential humanity reveals either Anne's fundamental misunderstanding of the man she had married, or her psychological inability to accept the reality of her situation. The trial of Anne's alleged co-conspirators began on May 12, 1536 AD, in Westminster Hall. The proceedings were a masterclass in judicial theatre, designed not to determine guilt or innocence, but to provide a veneer of legal legitimacy to what was essentially a political execution. The evidence against the men was largely circumstantial: gifts Anne had given them, conversations they had shared, and their presence at court events where opportunities for misconduct allegedly arose. Mark Smeaton's confession remained the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, but even this was problematic. Smeaton was a musician of modest birth who depended entirely on royal favour for his position. The idea that he would risk everything for an affair with the Queen stretched credibility, particularly given the extreme punishment such a relationship would entail. Yet his confession, extracted under circumstances that likely involved torture, provided the foundation upon which the entire conspiracy theory rested. Henry Norris, William Brereton, and Francis Weston all maintained their innocence throughout their trials, refusing to confess even when offered the possibility of commuted sentences in exchange for admissions of guilt. Their steadfastness in the face of certain death suggests either remarkable courage or genuine innocence, or perhaps both. These were men who had everything to live for and nothing to gain from protecting a queen who was clearly doomed. The trial of George Boleyn, held separately due to his noble rank, was perhaps the most dramatic of all. George was an accomplished orator and legal mind who chose to defend himself against the charges. His performance in Westminster Hall was so compelling that observers noted the jury seemed moved by his arguments and genuinely uncertain about his guilt. For a brief moment it appeared that at least one of Anne's alleged conspirators might escape the net Cromwell had cast. But George made a fatal error that revealed either his naivety about court politics or his desperate desire to clear his sister's name. When presented with a written question that he was instructed only to read silently, George instead read it aloud to the entire court. The question concerned Henry's alleged impotence and his inability to satisfy Anne sexually, information so damaging to the king's reputation that it sealed George's fate regardless of his guilt or innocence. The verdicts in all the trials were foregone conclusions. Norris, Weston, Brereton, and Smeaton were all found guilty and sentenced to the traditional punishment for treason, to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. George Boleyn, by virtue of his noble birth, was sentenced to death by beheading. The speed of the trials and the uniformity of the verdicts made clear that these proceedings were about political necessity, not justice. Henry's treatment of the condemned men revealed the calculating cruelty that characterized his entire handling of the affair. He commuted the sentences of the four commoners to simple beheading, a mercy that was proclaimed as evidence of his magnanimity, while actually serving to prevent the gruesome spectacle of hanging and quartering that might have generated sympathy for the victims. On May 17, 1536 AD, 5 men died on Tower Hill for their alleged relationships with Anne Boleyn. Mark Smeaton, the musician whose confession had started the entire affair, went to his death maintaining his guilt, perhaps from genuine remorse, perhaps from a final attempt to protect others, or perhaps from a mind broken by torture and terror. Henry Norris, William Brereton, and Francis Weston all proclaimed their innocence to the end, their final words carefully recorded by observers who understood the historical significance of the moment. George Boleyn's execution was the most poignant of all. As Anne's brother and closest ally, his death represented not just the loss of a life, but the destruction of the family that had risen so high and fallen so far. His final speech was noted for its dignity and his continued protestations of innocence, delivered with the eloquence that had made him a valued member of the king's inner circle. Anne, confined to her apartments in the Tower, would have heard the sounds of her alleged lover's executions, the crowds gathering, the executioner's axe falling, the roar of approval from spectators eager for blood. The psychological torture of knowing that men had died because of their alleged relationships with her, whether those relationships were real or fabricated, must have been almost unbearable. Meanwhile, Henry had already moved on with characteristic speed and callousness. Even before Anne's trial began, he was making arrangements for his marriage to Jane Seymour, the pale, quiet woman who represented everything Anne was not. Where Anne had been dark, passionate, and intellectually challenging, Jane was fair, submissive, and content to play the role of decorative royal wife. Anne's own trial was set for May 15, 1536 AD, in the Great Hall of the Tower of London. The location was significant. By trying Anne within the Tower itself, Henry avoided the possibility of public demonstrations in her favour, while ensuring that the proceedings took place under the intimidating shadow of the fortress where she was imprisoned. The trial itself was a study in Tudor pageantry and legal theatre. Anne entered the hall wearing a black gown, the color of mourning that served as a visual reminder of her fall from grace. She was accompanied by her ladies-in-waiting, who had been allowed to remain with her as both comfort and witnesses to ensure that her behavior during the proceedings was properly recorded. Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk and Anne's own uncle, presided over the trial as Lord High Steward. The sight of Norfolk pronouncing judgment on his niece was perhaps the most vivid illustration of the brutal realities of Tudor politics, where family loyalty was always subordinate to royal favor and personal survival. The charges against Anne were read in full, each accusation more damning than the last. She was accused of adultery with Henry Norris on October 6, 1533 AD, at Westminster Palace, with William Brereton on November 8, 1533 AD, at Westminster, with Mark Smeaton on April 26, 1536 AD, at Westminster, and with Francis Weston on May 20, 1534 AD, at Westminster Palace. The specificity of the dates and locations was intended to lend credibility to the charges, though it also revealed their fabricated nature. The precision was too perfect, too convenient for prosecutors who needed to prove their case beyond reasonable doubt. The incest charge involving her brother George was dated to November 2, 1535 AD at Westminster Palace, a date that placed the alleged crime well after Anne's last pregnancy had ended in miscarriage. The timing suggested not passionate transgression but calculated conspiracy, which served Cromwell's narrative of a queen so depraved that no crime was beneath her. Perhaps the most serious charge was that Anne had conspired to imagine and compass the death of the king, and had promised to marry one of her lovers after Henry's death. This charge of treasonous intent was the most difficult to prove, but also the most necessary. Without it, Anne's other crimes might have been seen as personal moral failings rather than threats to the state that required the ultimate penalty. Anne's response to the charges was carefully observed and recorded. Contemporary accounts describe her as maintaining her composure throughout the reading of the accusations, her face a mask of royal dignity that betrayed little of what she must have been feeling. When given the opportunity to respond, she denied all charges with a firmness that impressed even her enemies. Her defense was necessarily limited by the legal constraints of the time. As a woman and a subject, Anne had few rights in the proceedings. She could not call witnesses in her favor, could not cross-examine her accusers, and was not allowed legal counsel. The trial was structured to reach a predetermined conclusion, with Anne cast in the role of defendant in a proceeding where her guilt was assumed rather than proven. The evidence against Anne consisted primarily of testimony from servants and courtiers who claimed to have witnessed suspicious behavior or overheard compromising conversations. Much of this testimony was vague and circumstantial. A glance here, a private conversation there, gifts exchanged between the Queen and her alleged lovers. The prosecution relied heavily on interpretation and innuendo, building a case on the foundation of court gossip and speculation. One particularly damaging piece of testimony came from Lady Wingfield, who was conveniently dead by the time of the trial and therefore unable to be cross-examined. Lady Wingfield had allegedly told others before her death that she had knowledge of Anne's misconduct, though the specific nature of this knowledge was never clearly established. The use of testimony from a deceased witness who could not be challenged was a telling indication of the prosecution's desperation to build a convincing case. The speed of the trial proceedings was remarkable even by Tudor standards. The entire case was presented, debated, and decided in a single day, a pace that left little time for careful consideration of the evidence, or for Anne to mount an effective defense. The pressure to reach a quick resolution reflected Henry's eagerness to move forward with his plans for a new marriage and his desire to minimize the time available for public opinion to organize in Anne's favor. When the time came for the jury to retire and consider their verdict, there was little suspense about the outcome. The 26 peers who sat in judgment included men who owed their positions to Henry's favor and who understood that their own futures depended on delivering the verdict the king desired. Among them were some who had once been Anne's supporters, but who now found themselves in the position of condemning her to save themselves. The guilty verdict was announced by Norfolk, with what observers described as visible emotion, though whether this reflected genuine sorrow or relief at completing an unpleasant duty remains unclear. As Anne's uncle, Norfolk's position was particularly difficult. He was being forced to participate in the destruction of his own family member, while maintaining the fiction that justice was being served. The sentence pronounced upon Anne was death by burning or beheading, at the king's pleasure. The option of burning reflected the medieval punishment for women who committed treason, particularly those guilty of adultery against their husbands. The alternative of beheading was presented as a mercy, though it also served Henry's purposes by avoiding the horrific spectacle of a queen being burned alive in full view of the public. Anne's reaction to the sentence was noted by all present. She received the news of her condemnation with what contemporary accounts describe as remarkable composure, maintaining the dignity of her royal position even in the face of imminent death. Her response included a request that God save the king and a protestation of her innocence that rang through the great hall of the Tower with a clarity that moved even her enemies. But it was her private moments recorded by Sir William Kingston and the ladies who attended her that revealed the full weight of what she was enduring. In the days between her trial and execution, Anne swung between hope and despair, confidence and terror, in a way that revealed the psychological torture of her situation. She continued to express faith that Henry would show mercy, that their shared history and the love they had once felt for each other would count for something in the final calculation. This faith appears almost tragic in hindsight, given what we know of Henry's character and his treatment of other wives who had fallen from favour. Anne's inability to accept the reality of her situation may have been a psychological defence mechanism, a way of maintaining sanity in circumstances that would have broken most people. The question of Anne's actual guilt or innocence has fascinated historians for nearly 5 centuries. The evidence against her was largely circumstantial and based on the testimony of individuals whose own survival depended on pleasing the king. Mark Smeaton's confession, extracted under torture, formed the cornerstone of the case, but confessions obtained through torture were notoriously unreliable even by Tudor standards. The specific dates and locations cited in the charges against Anne present significant problems for those who believe in her guilt. Court records show that Anne was either pregnant or recently delivered during many of the times when she was allegedly conducting affairs, making the physical demands of multiple relationships extremely difficult if not impossible. Moreover, the intense scrutiny under which royal consorts lived made secret romantic relationships extraordinarily risky and difficult to conceal. The speed with which the charges were developed and the trials conducted suggests a predetermined outcome rather than a careful investigation of actual wrongdoing. Cromwell's efficiency in building the case against Anne and her alleged co-conspirators was remarkable, but it also raises questions about whether the evidence was discovered or manufactured. Perhaps most tellingly, none of Anne's alleged lovers, with the exception of the tortured Smeaton, confessed to their crimes even when offered the possibility of commuted sentences. Men facing certain death would have had every incentive to admit their guilt if it might save their lives, yet they chose to maintain their innocence to the end. The political context of Anne's fall also supports the argument for her innocence. By 1536 AD, Henry was desperate for a male heir and had already begun his pursuit of Jane Seymour. Anne's miscarriage in January of that year had effectively ended her usefulness to the king, making her an obstacle to his plans for a new marriage rather than an asset to be protected. Henry's character, as revealed through his treatment of other wives and political opponents, suggests a man capable of eliminating anyone who stood in the way of his desires. His willingness to break with Rome to marry Anne demonstrated his ruthlessness in pursuing his goals. His willingness to destroy her when she no longer served his purposes revealed the same calculating cruelty applied in reverse. Yet the question of Anne's guilt extends beyond the specific charges of adultery and treason to larger questions about her behavior and character. Contemporary accounts describe her as intelligent, ambitious, and politically astute, but also as sometimes arrogant and vindictive toward those who crossed her. Her treatment of Catherine of Aragon and Princess Mary had earned her numerous enemies at court, who were eager to see her fall. Anne's sharp tongue and quick wit, which had initially attracted Henry, may have become liabilities as their marriage deteriorated. Her willingness to argue with the king and challenge his decisions was unusual for a royal consort, and may have contributed to Henry's growing resentment of her influence over him. The intensity of Anne's relationship with her brother George also raised eyebrows at court, though there is no credible evidence to support the incest charges beyond the close emotional bond between siblings, who had risen together through the treacherous waters of Tudor politics. Their mutual support and obvious affection may have appeared suspicious to observers looking for evidence of wrongdoing, but it more likely reflected the natural alliance of family members navigating a dangerous world. As Anne awaited execution in the Tower, Henry was already making preparations for his next marriage. On May 14th, the day before Anne's trial, Archbishop Cranmer was summoned to Lambeth Palace to hear Henry's confession and to pronounce his marriage to Anne null and void. The speed of this proceeding revealed Henry's eagerness to clear the legal obstacles to his union with Jane Seymour. The annulment of Henry's marriage to Anne was based on the same theological arguments that had been used to dissolve his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, the claim that the union had never been valid in God's eyes. In Anne's case, Henry cited his previous relationship with her sister Mary as an impediment that made their marriage incestuous and therefore invalid from the beginning. The irony of this argument was exquisite. Henry was simultaneously claiming that Anne was guilty of adultery within their marriage, while also arguing that no marriage had ever legally existed between them. The logical contradiction was less important than the legal convenience. By declaring the marriage invalid, Henry could claim that Anne had never been queen and that their daughter Elizabeth was illegitimate. The psychological impact on Anne of learning that her marriage was being declared null and void must have been devastating. In a single stroke, Henry was erasing not just their relationship, but her entire identity as Queen of England. She was being reduced from a crowned queen to a woman who had lived in sin with the king, her daughter stripped of legitimacy and her life's work dismissed as meaningless. Meanwhile, the preparations for Anne's execution proceeded with the grim efficiency that characterized all aspects of Tudor administration. Henry had made the unusual decision to import a swordsman from Calais, rather than use the traditional axe that was employed for most executions. The choice of a sword over an axe was presented as a mercy. The French method was supposed to be quicker and more reliable than the English approach. The selection of a foreign executioner served several purposes beyond mere efficiency. It distanced Henry from the act itself, allowing him to present Anne's death as a matter of legal necessity rather than personal vengeance. It also eliminated the possibility that an English executioner might refuse the task or might be influenced by sympathy for the condemned queen. The executioner who arrived from Calais was described as an expert in his craft, a man who had performed similar services for the French court and who brought with him not just skill but the aura of continental sophistication. His very presence at the Tower was a reminder that Anne's death was being conducted according to the highest standards of European practice. The sword itself became an object of fascination and dread during Anne's final days. Unlike the heavy, brutal axe traditionally used for English executions, the executioner's sword was described as relatively light and sharp, designed for precision rather than brute force. The weapon was kept hidden until the moment of execution, adding an element of mystery to the proceedings that heightened the psychological tension. Anne's behavior during her final days revealed a woman struggling to maintain her dignity and sanity under circumstances that would have broken most people. Sir William Kingston's reports describe her as sometimes confident and defiant, other times weeping and despairing. She spoke frequently of her innocence and her faith that God would vindicate her, but she also made practical arrangements for her death with a clarity that suggested she understood the reality of her situation. One of the most poignant aspects of Anne's final days was her concern for her daughter Elizabeth. At not yet 3 years old, Elizabeth was too young to understand what was happening to her mother, but Anne was acutely aware that her death would leave the child orphaned and stripped of legitimacy. Her requests to see Elizabeth one final time were denied, adding another layer of cruelty to her final hours. Anne's ladies-in-waiting, who had been permitted to remain with her throughout her imprisonment, provided both comfort and surveillance during these final days. These women, who had once competed for the honor of serving the Queen, now found themselves in the impossible position of supporting a woman they knew was doomed, while protecting their own positions at court. The night before her execution, Anne spent hours in prayer and reflection, preparing her soul for what she believed would be her journey to judgment before God. Contemporary accounts describe her as calm and resigned, having finally accepted that Henry would show no mercy and that her death was inevitable. She also spent time preparing for the practical aspects of her execution, discussing with her ladies the clothing she would wear and the behavior that would be expected of her on the scaffold. Even in death, Anne understood that she would be performing for an audience, and that her final moments would be scrutinized for signs of guilt, innocence, repentance, or defiance. The morning of May 19, 1536 AD dawned grey and misty, with a dampness in the air that seemed to reflect the somber mood that had settled over the Tower. Anne woke early, having slept little during her final night, and immediately began the rituals that would prepare her for death. She chose to wear a dark grey damask gown with a white chemise beneath, colours that suggested both mourning and purity. The choice was significant. By wearing white, Anne was making a silent statement about her innocence, while the grey represented her acceptance of the death that awaited her. Her hair, which had once been her crowning glory and had first attracted Henry's attention, was arranged simply and covered with a white coif that would make the executioner's task easier. The practical considerations of execution influenced even these final personal details, reminding Anne that she was no longer a woman preparing for a social occasion, but a condemned prisoner preparing for death. Anne's final meal was simple, some bread and wine that she consumed more for the ritual significance than from any appetite. Food had little appeal for someone facing imminent death, but the act of breaking bread served as a final communion with life and a preparation for whatever lay beyond. As the morning progressed, Anne could hear the sounds of preparation outside her window. The scaffold had been completed during the night, and workmen were now testing its construction and arranging the straw that would absorb her blood. The practical preparations for death were conducted with the same efficiency that characterized all aspects of Tudor administration. The crowd began gathering early, drawn by the unprecedented spectacle of a queen's execution. While public executions were common entertainment in Tudor England, the death of a crowned queen was extraordinary, unprecedented in English history, and unlikely to be repeated. The Tower Green was filling with spectators eager to witness this historic moment. Among the crowd were courtiers who had once competed for Anne's favour, merchants who had profited from her patronage, and common people who had followed her rise and fall with the fascination that royal drama has always inspired. Some came from curiosity, others from a sense of historical duty, and still others from the darker human impulse to witness destruction and death. The Constable of the Tower, Sir William Kingston, arrived at Anne's apartments with the formal notification that her time had come. His demeanour was respectful but firm. He was there to escort a queen to her death, but also to ensure that a condemned traitor met the fate prescribed by law. Anne's response to Kingston's arrival was noted by all present. She rose from her chair with the dignity that had characterized her throughout her imprisonment, straightened her gown, and declared herself ready to meet her fate. Her composure was remarkable. She showed no signs of the hysteria or breakdown that might have been expected from someone facing imminent execution. The walk from her apartments to the scaffold was perhaps the longest journey of Anne's life. Each step took her further from the world of the living and closer to whatever lay beyond death. The route took her through the same courtyards where she had once walked as queen, past the same buildings where she had exercised royal authority and received the homage of her subjects. The contrast between her current circumstances and her former glory must have been almost unbearable. The same stones that had once echoed with the footsteps of those seeking her favour now witnessed her final journey to the scaffold. The tower that had been her palace during her coronation preparations was now the setting for her destruction. As Anne emerged onto Tower Green, the crowd fell silent. The sight of a queen walking to her death was so unprecedented, so shocking, that even the most hardened spectators were momentarily speechless. Here was a woman who had once been the most powerful person in England after the king himself, now reduced to the role of condemned criminal, approaching her final moment. The scaffold itself was a simple wooden platform, raised only a few feet above the ground to ensure that the crowd could witness the execution clearly. Unlike the high scaffolds used for male traitors, Anne's execution platform was designed for intimacy rather than spectacle, reflecting perhaps some vestige of respect for her former position as queen. The executioner was already present on the scaffold, a figure made mysterious by his black hood and the unfamiliar nature of his foreign garb. He stood motionless beside the block where Anne would kneel, his sword hidden beneath a covering of straw to prevent any premature glimpse of the instrument of death. Anne mounted the scaffold with steady steps, assisted by her ladies who had been permitted to accompany her to this final stage of her journey. Once on the platform, she turned to face the crowd, preparing to deliver the speech that custom demanded from all condemned traitors. Her final words have been preserved in multiple contemporary accounts, though there are slight variations in the exact phrasing. The essence of her speech was a protestation of her loyalty to the king and her acceptance of the judgment that had been passed upon her. She asked for prayers for her soul and expressed her hope that God would show mercy to her in the next world. What is most striking about Anne's final speech is what she did not say. She did not proclaim her innocence directly, nor did she attack Henry or the court that had condemned her. Whether this restraint reflected genuine acceptance of her fate, political calculation designed to protect her daughter Elizabeth, or simple physical and emotional exhaustion remains a matter of historical debate. After completing her speech, Anne removed her headdress and jewellery, placing them carefully in the hands of her ladies. The act of removing these symbols of her earthly status was both practical and symbolic. She was stripping away the last vestiges of her identity as queen and preparing to meet death as simply Anne Boleyn. Her ladies then blindfolded her with a white cloth, a final mercy that would spare her the sight of the approaching sword. The blindfold also served the practical purpose of ensuring that Anne would remain still during the crucial moment when the executioner struck, as any movement could turn a quick death into a prolonged agony. With the blindfold in place, Anne knelt beside the low block that had been prepared for her execution. Her posture was erect and dignified, maintaining the royal bearing that had characterized her throughout the ordeal. Even in these final moments, She remained conscious of the image she was presenting to posterity. The executioner approached with silent steps, his sword now revealed for the first time. The weapon was indeed different from the traditional English axe, longer, thinner, and designed for a single, precise stroke that would sever the neck cleanly. The sight of the foreign weapon added an exotic element to the proceedings that enhanced the sense of witnessing something unprecedented in English history. What happened next would be debated and analyzed for centuries. The executioner raised his sword, and in a movement so swift that many in the crowd missed it entirely, brought the blade down in a single decisive stroke. Anne Boleyn's head was severed from her body with a precision that spoke to the skill of the man Henry had imported from Calais. Contemporary accounts describe the crowd's reaction as one of stunned silence followed by a mixture of gasps, prayers, and murmured conversations. The reality of what they had witnessed, the execution of a queen, was so overwhelming that many spectators seemed unable to process what they had just seen. Some crossed themselves and whispered prayers for Anne's soul, while others simply stared in fascination at the scene before them. The executioner's efficiency was both a mercy and a horror. Anne's death was instantaneous, sparing her the prolonged agony that often characterized executions with the traditional axe. But the very speed of her destruction also emphasized the finality of what had occurred. One moment she was a living woman, the next she was merely a body on the scaffold. Anne's ladies, who had watched their mistress die with tears streaming down their faces, now performed their final service. They carefully gathered Anne's remains, wrapping her head and body in white cloth with the tenderness of women preparing a beloved friend for burial. Their grief was genuine and profound. These women had served Anne during her rise to power and had remained loyal to her even in her darkest hour. The crowd began to disperse almost immediately after the execution, as if the spectators were eager to escape the weight of what they had witnessed. The unprecedented nature of the event, the execution of a crowned Queen of England, left many feeling that they had participated in something that challenged the very foundations of royal authority and divine right. Within hours of Anne's death, Henry VIII was already moving forward with his plans for the future. He married Jane Seymour in a private ceremony on May 30th, 1536 AD, just 11 days after Anne's execution. The speed of this transition revealed Henry's eagerness to put the entire episode behind him and begin anew with a wife who promised to be more compliant and less challenging than her predecessor. But Henry's attempt to erase Anne from history was not entirely successful. Her daughter Elizabeth, though declared illegitimate, survived and would eventually become one of England's greatest monarchs. The woman Henry had destroyed in his pursuit of a male heir would be remembered through the daughter whose legitimacy he had denied. The men who had died alongside Anne were quickly forgotten by history, their names remembered primarily in connection with her story. Mark Smeaton, Henry Norris, William Brereton, Francis Weston and George Boleyn had all been sacrificed to Henry's need for a clean break from his second marriage. Their death served as a warning to anyone who might dare to challenge royal authority or become too closely associated with a fallen favourite. Thomas Cromwell, who had orchestrated the entire affair, continued to serve Henry faithfully until his own fall from grace and execution in 1540 AD. His fate served as a reminder that in Henry's court, even the most valuable servants were expendable when they no longer served the king's purposes. The question of Anne's guilt or innocence continued to haunt those who had participated in her destruction. Some, like Thomas Cranmer, would later express private doubts about the justice of her execution. Others, like the Duke of Norfolk, would maintain their public support for the verdict, while perhaps harboring private reservations about their role in condemning a family member. The broader implications of Anne's execution extended far beyond the immediate political consequences. Her death established a precedent that would influence Henry's treatment of his subsequent wives and would contribute to the climate of fear and uncertainty that characterized the latter part of his reign. The king, who had once been seen as a Renaissance prince, cultured and relatively moderate, was now revealed as a ruler capable of extraordinary ruthlessness in pursuit of his desires. The international reaction to Anne's execution was one of shock and condemnation. European courts, already horrified by Henry's break with Rome, now viewed him as a dangerous tyrant who had murdered his own wife to satisfy his lust for another woman. The execution damaged England's reputation abroad and further isolated the country from Catholic Europe. Yet for all the political calculations and international consequences, the human cost of Anne's destruction remained the most significant aspect of the entire affair. A woman who had once been the most powerful person in England after the king himself had been reduced to a headless corpse on a scaffold, her life sacrificed to her husband's ambitions and insecurities. The Tower of London, which had witnessed Anne's execution, would continue to serve as the stage for royal dramas and political executions for centuries to come. but the memory of that grey morning in May 1536 AD would linger in the stones of the fortress, a reminder of the price of royal favour and the dangers of standing too close to absolute power. Anne's burial was as hurried and undignified as her trial had been. Her remains were placed in an old elm chest that had once contained bow staves, and she was interred in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the Tower grounds. No elaborate funeral, no royal ceremony, no monument to mark the resting place of a woman who had once been Queen of England. The location of Anne's burial was fitting in its irony. She was laid to rest in the same chapel where many other victims of royal justice had been interred, including her own brother George and the men who had died as her alleged lovers. The chapel became a gathering place for those who had fallen from Henry's favour, a silent testimony to the deadly consequences of proximity to power. In the days following Anne's execution, life at court continued with a normalcy that was almost obscene in its callousness. Courtiers who had once competed for Anne's attention now focused their energies on ingratiating themselves with Jane Seymour. The machinery of royal government continued to function as if nothing extraordinary had occurred, as if the execution of a queen was merely another administrative task completed with typical Tudor efficiency. Yet beneath the surface normalcy, the trauma of Anne's destruction continued to reverberate through the court. Those who had witnessed her execution carried with them the memory of that swift, decisive stroke that had ended a life and changed the course of English history. The image of a blindfolded queen kneeling beside a block, maintaining her dignity even in the face of death, would haunt those who had been present for the rest of their lives. The psychological impact on Henry himself remains a matter of historical speculation. Contemporary accounts suggest that he showed no outward signs of remorse or regret, instead throwing himself into his new marriage with apparent enthusiasm. Yet the speed with which he moved to erase Anne from official records and public memory suggests a man desperate to escape the weight of what he had done. The official portraits of Anne were removed from royal residences, her initials were carved away from buildings where they had been proudly displayed, and her coat of arms was replaced with those of Jane Seymour. The systematic erasure of Anne's presence from the physical landscape of royal power was thorough and deliberate, as if Henry believed that by removing all traces of her existence, he could somehow undo the reality of what had occurred. But history has a way of preserving what rulers seek to destroy. Anne's story survived not just in official records, but in the memories of those who had known her, in the whispered conversations of courtiers who had witnessed her rise and fall, and in the growing legend of a woman who had challenged the established order and paid the ultimate price for her audacity. The execution of Anne Boleyn marked a turning point in Henry VIII's reign, and in English history more broadly. It demonstrated the extent to which royal power could be used to destroy even those closest to the throne, and it established precedents that would influence the treatment of subsequent queens and political opponents. The woman who had once been powerful enough to change the religious direction of an entire nation had been reduced to a cautionary tale about the dangers of overreaching ambition and the fickleness of royal favour. As the sun set on May 19, 1536 AD, the Tower of London settled into an uneasy quiet. The scaffold had been dismantled, the crowd had dispersed, and the physical evidence of Anne's execution had been cleared away. But the psychological and political consequences of what had occurred that morning would continue to shape English history for generations to come. The woman who had woken that morning to the sound of steel being sharpened was now at peace. Her struggles with Henry and the court finally ended. The blade that had been prepared with such care and precision had performed its function with deadly efficiency, silencing forever a voice that had once commanded the attention of kings and changed the course of nations. In the growing darkness of that May evening, as the Tower guards made their rounds and the Thames lapped against the fortress walls, the ghost of Anne Boleyn began its long haunting of English history. The woman who had been erased from official memory would live on in the stories told by those who remembered her, in the questions raised by historians who doubted her guilt, and in the legend of a queen who had dared to challenge a king and had paid for that audacity with her life. The sound of steel being sharpened had announced the beginning of Anne's final day. The silence that followed her execution marked the end of one of the most dramatic and tragic chapters in the long, blood-soaked history of the English crown. In that silence, pregnant with the weight of what had been lost and what had been destroyed, the true horror of Anne Boleyn's execution finally revealed itself. Not just the death of a woman, but the murder of possibilities, the destruction of a different future, and the triumph of fear over hope in the treacherous world of Tudor England.